well, if men are upset with their disposability role, that's because of patriarchy. Do you have comments to that? Is it really because of patriarchy that we go to war and that boys are doing sports that are damaging their development of their brain, and construction work and dangerous jobs? Is it because of patriarchy and because of men that men are disposable? Let's start with Paul.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to do is to get an understanding of what patriarchy is, which is essentially a system where property and title were handed down from father to son, from generation to generation. In the literal sense, that is patriarchy. And in the more figurative sense, in the ideological sense, patriarchy is a system that oppresses women and that operates for men's benefit at the expense of women. The patriarchy where title and deed were handed down from father to son, that existed. The patriarchy where women were oppressed for the sake and benefit of oppressive males in cultural-wide phenomena, that never happened. There is, I think, a knee-jerk from most gender ideologues to respond to every concern that happens to men as though it's all patriarchy, which is this almost unidentifiable massive something out there that we can maybe fix one of these days if you'll just help us tear it down and rebuild society. I don't buy that at all. There are certainly problems that men experience that evolved from our survival needs as a species. It required men to be, I think, throughout most of history, at more risk than women who carried children. That certainly I don't have any argument with, but did those survival needs necessitate campaigns that identify all men as potential rapists? Is that a problem that stems from patriarchy? I'm not buying that. I personally find that idea kind of offensive. And to say that all these problems are rooted in a largely mythical concept, to me just flies in the face of reality. And I'm sure Warren may have many other things to say about this, but I would say that if you want to understand the problem of male suicide, start looking at why men are killing themselves. Skip all the gender politics, skip all the ideology, and start looking at individual cases and doing research and data, which is really important. We need fields of study about males that is free of ideological control, so we can start understanding these problems, how they happen. We're not going to get there by wrapping everything up in the blanket of patriarchy and saying, there you go, because then how do we know patriarchy's been killed? Hannah Rosen just wrote an article, I think, that patriarchy is now dead. So, okay, all these problems should go away. I'm not buying that. But with that, I'll pass to Warren.
Yeah, good response. Basically, the world was not controlled by patriarchy. The world was controlled by the need to survive. And that need to survive has been common to all human beings throughout all of history. And the countries and the places where survival occurred, people figured out some type of usual division of labor. Usually in the more modern days, women raised children, men raised money. In the old days, women cooked the meals and risked their lives at childbirth. Men risked their lives in war to protect the children that women bore. And so, and both sexes neither sex had rights. Both sexes had obligations and responsibilities. When my father used to hear me at the beginning of the women's movement talk about women's rights, and then men's rights, and then gay rights, and then civil rights, he'd go, my goodness, when are you ever going to learn about responsibilities? What about obligations? What about duties? What about honor? Those are the things that you need to learn about as a male before you go from boy to man. And so when you look at it through the lens of survival, you realize that neither gender had rights, Both genders had responsibilities, both genders had obligations, both genders risked their lives in different ways, both genders sacrificed their lives for their children. Why did they do that? Probably partially biologically, that's the only way you got another generation, but also when you talk to men and women qualitatively, they both say exactly the same thing. I'm making these sacrifices in the hope, with the dream, that my children will have a better life than I had. That's the inspiration. That's the motivation. That's common to both sexes. And when gender studies only looks at one part of the scale, then here's what happens. But let's look at that as if the world were a family boat for a while, and men and women were both in the same family boat. In this family boat, in the old days, men rowed from the right side, raise money. Women learned you row from the left side of the boat, raise children. The women's movement, after divorces occurred, said, wait a minute, we want women to have the options and the ability to row from both sides of the boat, raise children and raise money. This was, in my opinion, something to be applauded. But nobody said to men, you need to be honored as much for raising children as for raising money. We need to not only train you and socialize you to raise children effectively, we need to honor you and respect you, and we need to encourage our daughters to fall in love with you if you're raising children as well as raising money. Then we would have both sexes able to row from both sides of the boat. Now, right now, what we have is women able to row from both sides of the boat, but if a man becomes unemployed, he can't row from both sides of the boat. So we have, so the boat gets rowed on just one side, and a boat that gets rowed on just one side is a boat that goes in circles. A boat that goes in circles is far more vulnerable to the rocks of recessions, and it sinks. So when either sex wins, both sexes lose. Gender studies as of today is only about one sex as if that one sex were a victim. For universities not to have every possible way of looking at gender, we have to open up and look at and not condemn before we even speak. The women's movement's gender studies programs has looked at the world through the spectrum of women's experience of powerlessness and women's experience of what they think is male power. They haven't looked at the world from men's experience of powerlessness and men's experience of what the power of women's beauty or youth is, or sexuality is, or sexual withdrawal is, or emotional ability to support them or not support them is. And that's the male experience of female power. But that's not the female experience of female power or powerlessness. So you have to look at the world from multiple areas of examination. You have to see the male experience of male powerlessness, the male experience of female powerlessness and power, the female experience of power and powerlessness, and the female experience of male power and powerlessness. And then you add things like class and other things to that. Then you have a discussion that helps everybody in the university understand her or himself and feel heard. But to have a discussion that is just from one perspective and call that a university, that insults the very concept of what freedom of speech, intellectual curiosity. Some people say I know more about men than anybody in the world, but I cannot get a job at any major university in the United States in the gender studies area, the area I know the most about, because I am not politically correct. And that's very sad. And so patriarchy is not the filter through which it's not the only defining filter of men and women. If men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women, here's some of the way the world would look like. We would make rules that every woman would be sexual with us whenever we would like. And that the women who are very young, maybe 13 or 14, would be very interested in us. that we would be, that when we were, that we would die, we have a longer life expectancy than women, that the world would be set up in such a way that we would not be the sex to commit suicide. We would be the sex to least be likely to commit suicide. The world would be set up in such a way that we would have women pay for us on dates because they valued us more than we valued them. And so that we would have women take the sexual initiatives and risk rejection, and we would sit back and say yes or no, depending on whether we wanted to or not. We would, if a woman went too far too quickly, we could yell date rape, but she couldn't, and she would be, she would have to wait until she was proved herself innocent, rather than the other way around. We would have men's studies classes and not women's studies classes. We would have women have to be the primary breadwinner and earn more money because the road to high pay is a toll road. It costs and it takes a lot out of somebody to work very hard. We would have three options when the children are born: the option to raise the children, the option to be involved in the workplace, or the option to do some combination of both. Women would have just one option, the option to raise money, or raise money. And then we would feel free to blame them if they raised more money and feel free to reject them if they didn't raise enough money. That's the way a patriarchy would look like. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what it would look like. We would have female-only draft registration and not male-only draft registration. Men would have the option to join the armed services, but not the obligation to join the armed services, the option to go to combat, but not the expectation to go to combat. That's the way a world would look like if it was a patriarchy.